I think Dave captured the importance of these small living entities that we don't understand, and we're trying to understand them, and yet it's so difficult to capture the phenomenal diversity in which they exist in us and around us. It's not only in the human body, but tonight's we're focusing on the human body. So I was going to ask Dave in Afrikaans, since he's a botanist and zoologist and ologist, I was going to ask him how his microbiome is. Because you have large trees, then you have bonsais, and then you have the microbiome, of microboom.
Ek wil asseblief nie nou antwoord nie.
Because I noticed him actually disappearing just before we started, so I was wondering how his microbiome is doing. Anyway, let's leave it there. We leave these kind of questions to Dave. And he warned me he's going to ask some thought-provocative questions. Back to the microbiology and the microbes that live in and around us. I guess if you do a simple Google search or you look at Wikipedia, you'll see the tremendous diversity of these microbes and how they impact our lives. Now, and typically you can start with the argument of, so how many cells do we have, microbial cells do we have in our bodies? And since the 1970s, there was actually one paper that estimated, looking at the typical composition of feces, human feces, and found that if you dry it, about 60% of that weight consists of microbial cells, bacteria, fungi, protozoa, and so forth. And the assumption then was that our intestinal canal, basically calculating the amount, that roughly calculated it to be 1 kilogram of, between 2 pounds, which is roughly 1 kilogram, and 6 pounds of that weight is actually microbes. So in other words, up to 6 pounds of our body could be microbes. Later estimates actually looked and see, well, that was probably an overestimation. And backtrack. On that estimation, they realized, or they recognized, if you look at the cell size and the weight, that we probably have 10 times more microbial cells in and on our bodies than human cells. So in other words, we're actually walking microbes, walking bacteria. I hate having my just looking one direction. So sorry, people, I have to kiss this microphone. So back to the story about the number of microbial cells in our body. So recent studies actually probably are more conservative, and we reckon it's about 1.3 times as many microbial cells in our bodies than our own human cells. And so for the longest time we thought, well, microbes are germs. And this is how microbiology developed over the last century, I would say. So most of our work is reactively. If you have a disease, we try to figure out what's causing this disease, if it's infectious, and then we treat with that and deal with that. And as a consequence, if you look at what's happening in a typical hospital, and apologize to the medical profession, I saw Ben walked in here, but he was quite sleepy, so I think he wouldn't take any notice. I don't know where Ben is now. Anyway, so if we look at the routine monitoring in hospitals, it's actually much less intense than what we do in water. But there are good reasons for that. As I said, in medicine we have to respond to whatever we have an infection. So there's not much preventative. But through the history, that was our mindset. We looked at the microbes that make us sick. And to a large degree, we basically ignored all the good guys. Dave, how much time do I have for this 15 minutes?
Oh, you're well in time.
Because now I'm getting to the part I want to talk about. So if we look at the diversity in our bodies, and let's first focus in the digestive tract. In other words, the gut microbiome. It's only in the last 5 years that we realized how they impact our lives. Probably more than 5 years. About 10, 15 years ago, we started to see, okay, well, ulcers, maagsiere, many of them are actually caused by microbial activity, by microbes infecting us. And then through this last 5 to 10 years, developing of genomics and the ability to look at the whole microbial community, in other words, all those different species. And by the way, with the best of our intentions, we cannot cultivate more than 1%. So at least 99% of the microbes in and on our bodies are unidentified. And the same applies to the soil, and the same applies to natural environments. So as a result of that, limitations we had, we really didn't acknowledge and realize the huge influence that they have on our bodies. And so, as I said, this last 5 to 10 years, we basically found this much more powerful tools in genomics, metagenomics, and starting to realize that there's a huge diversity. And when we start to look at the gene function and what they do, we're starting to see how important roles they play. I think many good examples exist. One, for instance, is they produce many of the minerals and vitamins that we can't produce ourselves, and also immune factors, which we can't produce ourselves. We are actually dependent on the microbes in our tummies and in our digestive tract to produce those, and then that gets reabsorbed or adsorbed in our colon and help us to prevent us to get sick. I think serotonin is a good example. The happy gene or happy compound, at least 80% of all that compound produced in our bodies are actually produced by the microbes in our intestines. So in other words, we are heavily dependent on our moods about how the microbes behave in our bodies. And by extension, the way we eat and what we eat also impact those microbes. So it's really difficult not to get overexcited about this and not to oversell the discipline of microbiology, but it's certainly something which is fascinating and how it impacts our everyday life. And as I already said, in the past, we basically look only at the negative consequences. In other words, where we get infection and microbes that spoil our food and so forth. And again, I have to emphasize the vast majority of them are actually the good guys. And so we certainly depend on their activity, also for our health. I think there's a good example in some of the glasses here, wine and beer. Obviously, that's a microbial process. These trees, the way they get the phosphate out of the ground is to a large degree facilitated by microbial activities on the roots. And there's so many examples that we can go on about that. I have a suspicion that my esteemed colleague here will ask all the fancy questions, so I'm probably won't dwell too much into this. So Dave, why don't we start with the discussion? That was an intro, and then you can, if you don't want to ask questions...
I have more than you can handle.
I know, that's my concern actually, but...
Let's start with the human body. I don't think in history has the human body been so clean. We use constantly in our toilets and bathrooms things that it will kill all germs, 99.9% of known germs will be killed, and then they add dead. It will be killed dead. This is the first thing I need to say. Do we need to kill everything 99.9% dead? But even more importantly, a thing that has struck me, I will tend to be crucified if there is a heaven. Right at the gate for bringing up my children like little pigs, because I made mud baths. Ek het vir hulle groot modderbaddens gemaak. And a child loses itself completely by being immersed like a pig and sucking on mud. But I think I read somewhere that the epidemiology of things like asthma in Western Europe is increasing dramatically because children don't get enough shocks of their immune system when they're young. I'm not saying that they should, what is a good word for, another word for snot? When I was at Robertson, we used to call it nuffies. Did anybody? Het iemand al van die woord nuffies gehoor? Je krap in jou neus vir nuffies. Anyway, children are inclined to eat this awful stuff. They're inclined to lick the cat from top to bottom. They suck on bits of the dog. Is this good? Which leads us to another question. The fashionable these days is to have a very finely engineered bikini cut when you have a child, a cesarean section. What has happened to old-fashioned birth in terms of inoculating this minute-old child with possibly life-giving organisms?
Well, I knew I shouldn't get Dave the chance to ask questions. So what is your question? Okay, I'll start by
comments.
I'm starting with the snot.
Right, okay.
Because it's easy, because we work...
The fields are level, we can call it snot now.
You started it. So, working with microbial biofilms, in other words, microbes growing on surfaces, quite often the other scientists refer to us as the people working with the snot because it's that slimy matrix. A good example is if you go at the intertidal zone of the oceans, those microbes growing on the rocks, that is basically a biofilm, and you can see there's a substance, a slimy substance to it, which is what we call EPS, extracellular polymeric substances. I don't remember these things so often. But back to Dave's comments, the reason why kids, that's probably an evolutionary development, why kids tend to eat that. And that is basically to continuously inoculate your digestive tract with this huge diversity of microbes that we depend on. Now, the argument, and there are actually some scientific manuscripts out there that contest that rule and say, well, or that finding say, well, there are so much of the mucus that we swallow anyway, that eating those googers probably is not so important. But yet, that is evidence that there is some evolution taking place. And the same applies to the pets now. So I think there are quite a number of studies out where they looked at meta-studies, in other words, huge sample numbers in the UK where they found households with pets, dog or a cat in the house, those kids tend to have less incidence of asthma. So I think that's well established, and it's no surprise. Oh yeah, you didn't ask. I was, when you started going in this direction, I was expecting you to ask about antimicrobial underwear or antimicrobial socks, because
I'm getting to that. Just finish.
But by the way, these questions weren't planted, especially the last one. You can see I'm avoiding the question here, or the comment. But anyway, so it certainly is, there are merit. If you're going to do a 7-day hike in the mountains and along the ocean, and you have you have only 2 pairs of socks with you, maybe it's not a bad idea to try these. I wouldn't encourage it, but I also wouldn't discourage it. To try these antimicrobial products that you can find in the market. If you have smelly feet, it may work for you. And I have to have this disclaimer, we do work with companies doing these kind of things, and sell these kind of things, and we quite often have quite severe arguments with them. I think one example is, maybe I shouldn't use brand names here, but many of your household, or your mouthwash liquids, your soaps, the shampoos, antimicrobial products, you see that the label says antimicrobial and claiming it kills 99.9% of the bad guys, which is not true. But the point is, if you can look at that ingredient list, until recently they were dominated one antimicrobial compound, which is triclosan, which is now slowly starting to phase out by the US EPA and other organizations, because they realize A, it doesn't work, and B, it also has some negative impact on the environment. Now, the interesting thing about triclosan is, if you look at the label of some of the growth media, in other words, the food that we use to cultivate bacteria, especially the one, Pseudomonas aeruginosa, which is the common infection in cystic fibrosis patients in the lung. If you want to cultivate that bacteria, you actually use triclosan as one of the ingredients in the food. And that's what they use in antimicrobial products. Well, in their defense, they use triclosan, if we use triclosan in our microbial food because we want to exclude other organisms, so you select as one organism. But it can be dangerous in this context. So we get back to Dave's last comment, the caesarean sections, and that's a valid point. And there's recently, I think as recently as this year, in January 2016, an article about the difference. Well, we know there's a difference, caesarean sections and natural birth, because with natural birth, the baby gets inoculated. In other words, receive that microbial community, which they need to their bodies to function. Okay, I mean, there are many instances where we do experimentation where they aseptically, in other words, they using sterile techniques, remove an animal from a cow or an Eve, and then cultivate them completely absent of microbes. And those never perform as well, gain weight and so forth, as one that's actually been infected. So in the case of the cesarean, we risk the potential that that critical initial inoculation that the babies need is lost. And so the study I just referred to, they actually, what they do is, I didn't plant this question, you asked it.
I want you to hear the whole thing.
Thanks to my colleague Gideon Wolfaardt who sent me this article, that I have something to say about this, otherwise out of and I here. So what they suggest now is that if we do a cesarean, is to still basically expose the newborn baby to birth canal fluids to make sure we get that natural transfer of microbes which the body would need and the baby would need to have a head start in life. So again, I don't know what Dave else would ask, but I think it's also relevant, it's not really much momentum yet, but there's a lot of potential with the concept of repopulate. Now, I don't know if some of you have read about this, because we know one of the consequences of antimicrobial dosages, and again, I think there's so much work being done and new discoveries being made in this last decade or so, in the clinical world. And we know the disadvantages of antimicrobials and the overuse of antimicrobials and the resulting problems we have with hospital-acquired infections and people dying because they go to the hospital, something else, they get infected and they die. So I think the whole medical profession became much more sensitive to careless prescription of antibiotics, which is a very good thing. And that came from within, it wasn't forced upon them. One of the consequences of antimicrobial antibiotic treatment is that we do, especially the broad spectrum antibiotics, is that we also kill these good guys that we're talking about here, right? And we know some of the ways to prevent that. We can eat more yogurt, we can take probiotics. Most of us know what these are, and the benefits of having those good bacteria coming with the yogurts. But given the huge diversity, as I said, there are thousands of different species of microbes in our intestines. So to replace them with a probiotic which only has 1 or 2 species in is really not sufficient. And so now they're looking at this new direction is to repopulate. In other words, you basically need to take feces or the composition of that microbial species in feces and give it back to the patient again. Now it's not so simple, because in one of the major threats here is, so you already have a person that is sick, right? So his or her own immune system has been compromised by medicine, by antibiotics, by disease. Their own natural defense army, the microbes, have been knocked out by antibiotics. If you then if you're not careful, and take the microbial population, the full community, from another person, a donor, and you give it to this person, that donor may carry some disease-causing bacteria themselves, but because they have a healthy immune system, they suppress those, right? So they don't get sick. But to give it to a patient with a compromised immune system, you risk serious disease and even fatalities. So because of that, this field is slowly progressing. And you can imagine the issues of litigation if somebody would get this treatment and die because of this treatment. So there's a group, and I'm not kidding. They call themselves, and I actually work with one of them in Canada. They refer to repopulate. So what they're trying to do is to find. Should I stop? I saw you.
Ek grol net. Ga net aan.
You ain't seen nothing yet. So yeah, it is really a new nascent field that's developing. So all those entrepreneurs out there, my suggestion would be is to find. I think the simple solution would be to preserve your own. So in other words, I see not a sperm bank or whatever other bank, currency bank, it's to see a poo bank. And I won't be surprised if that's coming pretty soon. So that's one of the realities that we deal with.